Hey everybody, what's going on? And welcome to GNR Central. And today I want to talk about how the man who discovered Guns N' Roses, Tom Zutaut, became blacklisted from doing anything associated with a band or even coming to, listening parties and events by frontman Axl Rose. So the story kind of starts back in the mid 80s. It was, 1985, 1986. Tom Zutaut is an A&R rep for Geffen Records. He had made a pretty good career so far. He's the one who signed Metallica to Elektra, as well as Motley Crue, and Guns N' Roses was going to be another big band he was going to discover. And it's funny, he went and saw them play a gig. He didn't even get through the first two songs, and he went to David Geffen at Geffen Records and said, I just saw the biggest band who's going to sell more records than any other band, except for maybe the Rolling Stones. And he was given permission to give them a $75,000, basically to sign with Geffen Records. And it took him a while to finally get a producer on board to start working on Appetite, but he was able to make it happen. And he stayed in the band's good graces for about 5-6 years. He helped get Appetite done, Lies, the Illusions records, and the Spaghetti Incident. But then somewhere along the lines, things started to fall apart between him and Axl. And this largely had to do not with contractual stuff or money, which you would think a lot of it may have to do with, but his ex-girlfriend, Erin Everly, or his ex-wife, Erin Everly, I should say. So they used to have a lot of fights, Axl and his ex-wife. If you guys have ever seen any of the documentaries, or even read any of the books about Guns N' Roses, then you'd know that's the case. And often Tom would get drawn into these fights, and he would have to play mediator. And he said a lot of the time that Erin would instigate Axl, and he had to go tell her to stop doing that. And she basically went to Axl and claimed that Tom hit on her. And that's what created the bad blood between Tom and Axl. And then Tom kind of fell out with Guns N' Roses. He worked with Geffen for a little bit longer, but then by 1999, he was out of Geffen. He had a falling out with the label. And by 2001, he was basically living in New York City raising his daughter. And one day he gets a call from Jimmy Iovine, who at that point was the head of Geffen. It was February 2001, and Axl was struggling with Chinese democracy. Geffen was panicking because they basically staked the success of the label in the future on this one album. And they thought that Tom was the only guy who was going to be able to get the album out. So after much convincing, Tom reluctantly agreed to finally take the gig. So he decided that if he was going to work with Guns N' Roses, he'd have to move to LA, and he was going to be on call 24/7 because Axl would work at weird hours, and he was a very demanding guy to work with. And he also was worried that it might take a toll on his marriage at the time as well. Now, it's important for people to recognize that Tom Zutaut was really the band's savior. When Appetite came out, it was not an initial success. I mean, it took about a year for the album to hit big, but for the first few months after it came out, it sold about 250,000 copies, which back then wasn't really a whole lot. MTV wasn't playing Welcome to the Jungle, and he really had to go talk personally to David Geffen and convince him to call MTV and get them to play Welcome to the Jungle. And it was that single event that really caused things to start the momentum going in Guns N' Roses' direction. So the gift that Tom had was that he knew Axl's language and he knew what Axl wanted. So one of the first tests he had to basically pass was they were working on the drums for the title track, and he wanted the drums to sound like Dave Grohl's drums in Nirvana's song Smells Like Teen Spirit. And they had Roy Thomas Baker there producing the record at the time. Now, Roy Thomas Baker did a number of the Queen records, so it seemed like an obvious choice for a guy to produce Chinese Democracy with Axl being such a huge Queen fan. And they just weren't able to get the drums right. So Tom went to Tower Records down the street from the studio, purchased Nevermind, brought it back, and they compared the drum sounds. And he was able to get it on the first try, and Axl was so happy with him. He says, "Where were you 2 years ago when I could have used all this help?" So as Tom Zutaut started to work on the record, it started to come together. So he said, "We were finishing tracks," confirms Tom Zutaut, "doing overdubs with Buckethead and Robin Fink and some stuff with Tommy Stinson. I felt we had a really well-finished version of the Blues Madagascar Chinese Democracy. Atlas Shrugged was pretty good. We replaced a lot of drums because Axl's belief is that the record is supposed to be the energy of the people involved in creating it. We had to replace Josh Freese's drumming, and his drumming was spectacular. I would not have wanted to be in Brain's shoes. Basically, we were saying to him, we've got a brilliant performance of this, now you need to recreate it." So he also revealed that he recognized some of his work on the leaked versions of the songs that came out over the years. He said some of it's the same and some of it's different. For instance, I've heard the leaked version of Chinese Democracy that has some really weird keyboards in it, and I don't like the sound of it at all. The stuff that I worked on back in '01 smoked its ass. but it's pretty dicey to try to compare what's been leaked. We don't know if it was intentional. We don't know who leaked it. It could be a board mix that was meant for the keyboard player so he could learn his parts. So one song that was causing problems for Axl was Madagascar. So the song, of course, samples the famous Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, and it was a sample which they didn't really have the clearance during Zutaut's time on the album. So he said Axl feels that particular speech is at the core of the message that he's trying to put across in that song, says Zutaut. And he told me that if Martin Luther King's estate would not give permission for that to come out on the final record, that track would not be on Chinese Democracy. I subsequently found out that the recorded rights to the speech belonged to Universal, so I figure that Coretta King, who was the wife of Martin Luther King, is no longer alive. So unless her kids are violently opposed to being associated with Axl Rose, Universal should be able to work that out. So shortly after that, that's when the Black Hawk Down incident happened. So a month later, Axl all of a sudden sacked Tom Zutaut in an advanced screening of Ridley Scott's new movie Black Hawk Down. So Ridley Scott wanted to use Welcome to the Jungle in the movie. So the scene he wanted to use Welcome to the Jungle in was when the soldiers are getting ready to go out on their mission, which would be the Black Hawk Down mission. And that's typically what they would listen to before they went out on raids. But instead, they ended up using the recorded by Guns N' Roses touring mates, Faith No More. So the story goes that Ridley Scott, who was the director of Black Hawk Down, wanted to use Welcome to the Jungle, and negotiations had started to see if the movie people would accept a re-recorded version by the new lineup. So this led to an internal dispute centered around the wisdom of doing such a thing. So Betta, who was interviewed for this article, claimed that Axl was reluctant to re-record, telling Zutaut, "Listen, we're making the album. Now we have to stop and do this. It's too difficult." For his part, Zutaut claims the song had already been re-recorded by the band. Part of Axl's induction process for his new band was that they re-recorded every song off of Appetite, he says, so we just had to spend a day mixing it. It's difficult to try and explain why Zutaut was sacked, but it centers around the fact that Axl had requested a private screening of the movie, which was a pretty standard request, and when he turned up to find strangers there, he felt that Zutaut had misled him over the nature of the screening. He said, "Who the F are all these people in there?" says Tom. "I was told that this would be my private screening. I don't know who these effing people are. I can't believe you lied to me about this. You told me it was a private screening. You're fired." So Zutaut, meanwhile, claims to have been set up by someone looking to discredit him, an accusation that was denied by Axl Rose's camp. Whatever the truth, Zutaut was off the album, and producer Roy Thomas Baker would follow a few months later. Buckethead would hang on until 2004, and when he left, the band ended up issuing a statement saying, "During his tenure with the band, Buckethead has been inconsistent and erratic in both his behavior and his commitment, despite being under contract, creating uncertainty and confusion and making it virtually impossible to move forward with recording, rehearsals, and live plans with confidence. His transient lifestyle has made it impossible for even his closest friends who have nearly any form of communications with him whatsoever." So according to Tom Zutaut, he said that the album was pretty close to being finished during his time with the band. He said not only was there a clear intention to finish the album, but the vast majority had been finished, he claims. "By the time I left, I felt there was probably 11 or 12 tracks that just needed final mixes. We could have had the record out for September 2002. I don't think it would have been an issue. I would have been given it another 3 months for a few more overdubs and 3 for mixing, and worst case scenario, out spring of 2003. So that does it for this episode of Guns N' Roses True Story. I hope you guys enjoyed that. Let me know your thoughts on the whole story. I think it's a shame that they just didn't license Welcome to the Jungle instead of re-recording it or just using the re-recorded version of it. Now, if you guys remember, the Adam Sandler movie Big Daddy, which came out in 1998, featured a re-recorded version of Sweet Child of Mine that transitioned into a live version of the song. So that was the first time and the only time we've ever heard a re-recorded version of Appetite from Guns N' Roses. And finally, Tom Zutaut's name came back up almost 7 years later when Chinese Democracy was first released. So what happened around the time it was released, they had a lot of listening parties for the album, especially in Hollywood. And it came up that Tom Zutaut was escorted out, or I guess kicked out of a Chinese Democracy listening party. So one day after the album dropped, there was a listening party held at the Roxy Theater in West Hollywood, California. So he told Classic Rock magazine at the time that, "Yeah, sadly it is true that I was escorted out of the Roxy by a beefy security guy just prior to the last 3 songs of the playback. I did stand on the sidewalk and hear the last 3 anyways." He said, "I believe that the love and hate are a complicated thing, but ultimately the same thing. I love Axl and think that Chinese Democracy is a genius body of music, although I had heard most of the album in an unfinished form 6 to 7 years ago, and more recently through some of the leaks, I really wanted to hear it played back over a loud PA in its final form as imagined by its creator Axl Rose. It is sad and disappointing to me that those around Axl would lie to him to fuel his hatred towards me with imaginary events used to drive a wedge between us. I love him deeply and will always love him and wish only the greatest success to one of the world's last true creative musical sparks with a God-given voice. I'm proud of my contributions to his career and I'm always there for him should he one day become enlightened to the truth of what surrounds him. It is also sad that he doesn't mention the hard work I put in on my short involvement with the album, with even a thank you, considering lesser players are credited or thanked in the liner notes. Even those are ridiculed, belittled, and made fun of him behind his back while I defended his genius till those around him poisoned him against me with distortion and lies. I wear his hatred as a badge of honor, as it would be far worse for him not to care at all. So that does it for this episode of Guns N' Roses True Story. I hope you guys enjoyed that. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. I've always wondered how somebody was able to pick him out and kick him out 7 years later. I thought it would be water under the bridge, but I guess not. So let me know your thoughts. Go subscribe and go to gnrcentral.com for the latest and greatest Guns N' Roses and related news. Take care.